Chapter 7 AP Environmental is going to deal with aquatic biodiversity really into two parts. First part being marine ecosystems, and the second part being freshwater ecosystems, of which we are much more familiar living where we do. You can see a picture of that person handing up our blue planet. The reason we are known as a blue planet, of course, is because about 71% of our planet is made up of oceans. So aquatic life zones, again, 71% of our planet is made up of aquatic life zones. That includes freshwater too. 40% of our world population, which is spelled wrong, lives along the coasts. 50% of U.S. population lives within 62 miles of the coast. Think about how densely packed California is along the coast, how Florida is if you go from Miami north on the east side of Florida. It's very densely packed. So a lot of people obviously like the water. Salt water is marine water. It's generally about 3% salinity. That can vary, obviously. Oceans and estuaries are included in here. Estuaries, rather, are where fresh water meets salt water. Very highly productive ecosystems. Coastlands, shorelines, coral reefs, mangroves, forests, we're going to break those all down. The picture to the right is actually a mangrove forest, which is excellent habitat, unfortunately being destroyed by many countries. And then freshwater, we're going to break it down by lakes, rivers and streams, and inland wetlands. So, four main types of organisms in aquatic systems. First of all, the plankton, also known as the drifters. You can see the picture on the right. Thousands of different types of plankton. Plankton is just a generic way of saying photosynthesizing protist. Phytoplankton is the base of the food chain. Again, phytoplankton is plankton. It's just a little bit longer. Plankton is shortened. Phytoplankton are, of course, things that are the base of the food chain because they're primary producers. Because the ocean is so vast, they're deemed the base of the food chain because there's so many of them in the oceans. What eats phytoplankton is zooplankton. Zooplankton are animal-like protists. They're heterotrophs like us. There's a new classification that kind of recently got thrown in the mix, something called ultraplankton. They're photosynthetic bacteria, teeny tiny, but they do contribute to our primary productivity and, of course, to our world's oxygen supply. Second category of organisms is nekton. Nekton are the swimmers, probably the ones that you think about when you think about the oceans. Fish, turtles, whales, sharks, things of that nature that tend to be a little bit more near the surface or follow a food source. Benthos are bottom dwellers, things like barnacles and oysters. Whenever you see the word benthos or benthic, for that matter, whether it be in a salt or freshwater system, that means bottom. And of course, we've got decomposers along this food chain. Advantages and disadvantages of marine ecosystems. First of all, physical boundaries are much less fixed. If you think about terrestrial boundaries, when we go from a tundra to a taiga, for example, obviously trees start growing. When we get a taiga, the conifer trees, there's a pretty clearly delineated boundary. However, with the oceans, we have much less fixed. It makes it much harder to establish population counts because schools of fish constantly are on the move. Food webs are longer. The reason they tend to be longer is those fish particularly tend to be cold-blooded. It's generally estimated that 20% of the ecological efficiency carries through to the next energy level, so those food chains and food webs can be much more complex and much longer. It takes less energy loss, and a variety of bottom habitats come into play with this too, which we'll get to in a second. The problem with the oceans, one of the problems is it's so huge it makes them really hard to study. The other side of that is a lot of people think, hey, we can throw all the trash we want into the oceans and no big deal, it's so vast, but that has over time come to get us. Most aquatic species do live on the top, some in the middle, some of the bottom layers of the oceans. Key factors really that come into play with the distribution of organisms. First of all, temperature. Even around here in our lakes, what happens is our lakes in the springtime start out really cold, and then as they warm up, the surface warms up, of course, much quicker than the bottom. Fish tend to like cold water because that's where the dissolved oxygen is. They're going to follow that dissolved oxygen. So if you're a person that likes to bass fish, for example, you're going to want to start out in the springtime fishing kind of a little bit more top water, particularly when they're spawning, but then they're going to go deeper after that. Walleye are another great example of that too around here. So dissolved oxygen content, that's bolded because that is the number one factor that allow fish populations to be maintained. If we don't have dissolved oxygen in the water, of course, they're not going to live. Just like if we don't have oxygen in the air around us, we're not going to live either. The amount of food is obviously an issue where aquatic species are going to be. The amount of light nutrients needed for photosynthesis is in a zone called the euphotic, also known as the photic zone. Photo means light, of course. That's why it's called that zone. So the photosynthesizers are going to be in there. If you think of the lakes around here, if it's a real dirty lake, that euphotic zone is going to be really limited. If it's a really clean, pristine lake like Beaver Lake, that is going to be, the photosynthesizers can live all the way to the bottom in a very shallow, clean system. Life zones are variable, of course. Dissolved oxygen, as I said, very important, tends to be higher near the surface. The reason is that's where the phytoplankton tend to live because they can photosynthesize in the euphotic zone. CO2 levels tend to be lower near the surface because those photosynthesizers are using it. Tends to be higher in the deeper area because we do have a lot of species that live in the bottom of lakes and the ocean, and they produce that carbon dioxide. We don't have the photosynthesizing agents to take those in. Open oceans are limited because of things like nitrates and phosphates and iron. Most of that stuff comes off the shoreline, mainly in fertilizers, unfortunately. And what happens is coastal regions tend to blossom because of that. But on the open ocean, they don't have that. That's a huge limiting factor. Shallow waters are well supplied with nutrients, of course. Deep sea creatures do rely on detritus material. There's something called marine snow. So when things die on the surface, they actually float down, and those animals will eat them on the bottom. The problem is these deep sea creatures are very vulnerable to overfishing. We're going to talk about that down the road, unfortunately. So here is the ocean zones. The first zone is something called the coastal zone. So if you think about it, the coastal zone is right here. The good old movie Finding Nemo. They were in the coastal zone, of course. Then they went to the drop-off. The drop-off is where the continental shelf drops. That can go anywhere from 100 feet to all of a sudden 1,000 feet. Varies in different areas. So the coastal zone is where the high tide mark to the edge of the continental shelf. About 90% of all sea life is in there. That stat's important. Keep that in mind. Very high net primary productivity, again, because there's a lot of photosynthesizers. It only occupies about 10% of the oceans, but about 90% of the marine species do live there. The reason? There's ample sunlight and nutrients. If there's sunlight, there's producers, thus the base of the food chain, and then we have a lot of animals. Wind and currents do redistribute that as needed, sometimes in the open ocean, obviously, where bigger animals can absorb. Estuaries and coastal wetlands. Estuaries, you can see the picture right here, this freshwater system right here floating down where it meets there. The most popular one that you probably know about is where the Mississippi enters the Gulf of Mexico, which I'll show you in a bit. A lot of people think estuaries, because there's freshwater and saltwater mixing, aren't going to have a lot of plants and animals, but actually they do. Very high area of net primary productivity. We do have plants and animals that are adapted to both, and a lot of times they're adapted to varying levels. So we get varying levels in this region. We also get a lot of runoff from land. We've, of course, got variable salinity and temperature in these regions. So the animals do have to be well adapted, and plants for that matter, but very high productive areas. Mangrove swamps, as we opened up with, are really cool. Basically, think about them as trees growing in the water. A lot of times they're kind of like in the picture, they're bigger. A lot of times they're bushier, kind of. Excellent habitat for animals that live in there. They do grow in sheltered regions of the tropical coast. Of course, we don't have any around here. They've got them in Florida. The Caribbean is loaded with these things. They collect mud and anaerobic sediment. They are excellent filters. If there's pollutants that are on shore, they will catch them and filter them out. The problem is a lot of our mangrove swamps are actually being destroyed right now and drained, or they're being used to purposely raise fish, and that's really wreaking the ecosystem. So what are the important ecological and economic services? First of all, estuaries and the mangrove swamps are very, very highly productive. Organisms do well with varying temperatures and salinity, and again, think about these mangrove swamps. They grow right on the shoreline, so that would be very shallow water, 3 to 4 feet of water generally. Coastal aquatic systems do maintain water quality by filtering. They get those toxic pollutants coming off. They can capture excess plant nutrients and sediment, so basically it captures it before it gets into the ocean, kind of very similar to what we'll talk about with marsh or wetland areas too. They do provide food, timber, fuel wood, habitats, and breeding grounds. Unfortunately, some nations are taking too much of that. And they do reduce storm damage and coastal erosion. So if we have things even as severe as hurricanes, what happens is they can slow down the effects. So they're very productive. Just a last little slide right here. This is the Mississippi River, of course, where it hits the Gulf of Mexico right in here, and that's called a delta. Very productive freshwater ecosystem and saltwater ecosystem coming together. The problem with it is, if you look here outlined, that is the Mississippi River drainage basin. So basically all the water, not in this area because our water in Brookfield goes to the Great Lakes, but all the water starting out just kind of west of Madison, everything is going to go into here, and everything that is with that water is going to go down into this region here. And the reason I say that is because any excess fertilizers and pesticides and garbage, anything like that, is eventually going to flow down to the Mississippi River, and it's going to end up in the Gulf of Mexico. They have something down in that region called hypoxia. Excuse my handwriting. Hypoxia is a dead zone. So if you go out kind of where I drew this picture right here, and fishermen down there hate this, but what happens is we've got all those nutrients down there go through the stages of eutrophication, which I'll hit in a second or in a little bit. Hypoxia is a dead zone down there where there's really not great fishing because we have all that excessive nutrients going down there. All right, that's it for part 1.